Thank you everybody for joining us here in the field reports room. Our first presentation is from Naomi Peck on the phonetics and phonology of Mindri, a dialect of Kera'a, and I'm sure she will correct my pronunciations there. So yeah, thank you, Naomi. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, thanks. Hello everyone. I'm currently in Germany at the moment, so if I sound a little bit tired, I do apologize in advance. So today I'll be introducing to you the phonetics and phonology of Mindri, which is one of the dialects of Kera'a, which is a Sino-Tibetan language spoken in India. So first I'll introduce you to the language and the dialect a bit before going through the different subsystems of phonology, and then kind of ending with some more general comments about how the dialect fits into the language as a whole. So here on the left is a map, and we see here in these kind of two black outlined areas. So that's where Kera'a is spoken. It's the Lower Dibang Valley and Dibang Valley districts of Arunachal Pradesh in India. Kera'a is spoken by up to 12,000 speakers. We don't really have a good idea of how many speakers there actually are. The language is currently threatened. And another thing we don't have a really good idea about is how the language fits into Sino-Tibetan as a whole. We know, well, we believe it is Sino-Tibetan, and then we believe it is closest related to a neighboring language spoken about here, called Taoram. In between, it's not really clear at all. So zooming in on Kera'a a little bit, there's two main varieties of the language. There's Midu and there's Mitu. And within Midu, you can actually separate that out a little bit further with two subdialects, Mindri and Mihi. So if you look at kind of where the red things are, so down here is the lower belt with Roing, and that's where Midu and Mihi is spoken. Here is the middle belt where Mitu is spoken, and up here at Anini is where Mindri is spoken in the upper belt. And my supervisor, Utarainu, has been doing some work on the middle belt dialect Mitu. And then I joined her last year and started some work on Mindri. There's been a little bit of description mainly on the kind of lower two varieties. There's a description in Chinese of the variety spoken like one village over the border. There's some handbooks and things like that floating around, but we still don't have a really great idea of how the language works yet. As for why this dialect is called Mindri, Mi is the great Sino-Tibetan root for person. And then here, if your screen is big enough, hopefully you can see that this here is the Dri River. So Mindri literally means people of the Dri River. Now, this presentation is based on data that I collected over a month period just before COVID really hit in February and March this year. And the more kind of detailed phonetic analyses were done on recordings with two younger speakers, a 26-year-old female from Anini and a 29-year-old male from Italy, which is right here. It's about 353 words with 3 to 6 tokens per word, with a little bit more from the female speaker. And then I processed these recordings in the EMU system and R, and some secondary stuff I also did in Prot. Now, to give you a little bit more context into what the tokens are, there were two contexts, an isolation and a frame context. In this frame context, it was the nice classic frame, I said X, ngame, something, laya. And the reason we have both of these is because we do see quite a marked list intonation in an isolation context. So here is my F0 trace of one of my mouse speakers saying night, and we can see here in the red circles there's quite a big rise 4 pattern, and I'll just play it for you now. Hopefully this comes through. Yeah. Can someone give me a nod if they heard? Yeah, perfect. All right, I'll play it again. Yeah. Sorry, it's a little bit soft. But yeah, it's pretty much to say it's important to keep in mind that intonation does have an effect on how tone is realized. All right, now moving into more of the analysis of the system itself. So this is the basic consonant inventory that I currently posit for Mindri. In the gray here, we have more marginal phonemes, but we can see there's some nice series here in the bilabial, alveolar, and velar, voiceless, aspirated, and voice consonants, as well as nasals. the fricative and affricate section is a little bit messy. It's not quite sure. It's not very clear how voiceless and voiced sounds correspond there. There are 4 nice approximants here, but the lateral approximant is actually marginal, and I'll touch on this in a little bit later. And the other thing I think to note is I posit the glottal stop as a phoneme as well. And I'll get a little bit into why I believe this is true later on as well. Here are some minimal pairs. Most of the stops, sorry, all of the stops are segmentally contrastive in front of the low vowel. The fricatives are mostly contrastive in front of an E. It's a little bit hard to get everything, so that's I mentioned was marginal. I've only got really in front of an E rather than an E, but you take what you can get. So one thing I did mention in the abstract that I found a little bit curious when I was analyzing this is the voiced phonemes. So the voice stops don't actually come out as normal voice stops. They actually come out as pre-nasalized stops. So you can see here in the waveform, there's a little bit of a burst there on the M before the release here and then into the vowel. And at first, I didn't perceive this, and then I think I read a little bit and I was like, hang on, this is a pre-nasalized stop. And I'll play it for you a few times. Hopefully you can hear. So this is the word for go in isolation.
Ba, ba, ba.
And if you listen closely, you can hear an initial nasal there.
Ba, ba, ba.
However, this doesn't actually get realized as a prenasalized stop all the time. So in the case here, where it is not word initial, you do find it just come out as a voiced stop. So here, my female speaker says go, so you go, and it doesn't come out with the prenasalization here. So I'll just play this one for you now.
Nuba,
And again,
nuba,
and once more.
nuba.
So based on this, you can posit the kind of rule that a voice stop comes out with a prenasal element in word initial position. It did turn out to be a little bit more complex in that we actually also find this without affricates. So it seems to be extended across all abstruents. So here is the word for sit. You can see that the nasal here is even a little bit more distinct in the waveform. So we see this nasal and then the frication and then the vowel. And then I'll play the sound for you. I think it is a little bit more easy to perceive in this context as well.
G, G, G.
And once more.
G, G, G.
So the overall rule does seem to be that voiced obstruents come out with a homogenic nasal in word initial position. The prosodic domain for this rule might be a little bit more complex, but that will await further testing to see what's going on there. Now, moving on to the vowels. There are 11 vowels that I believe are phonemically distinctive, so 6 oral, 5 nasal, and they do correspond across the kind of 5 main vowels. And here, although I've written it with the back unrounded graph, I think phonologically it's not really a back vowel. It does come a little bit more forward when you when it's realized, but the here doesn't also have a nasal counterpart. All right, so there's some minimal pairs here with the oral vowels. They do kind of form a nice set after glottal stops and after an initial h. There's nothing more I can really say here. They contrast, it's nice. And when we look at this on a vowel plot, so these come from all the tokens I have from my female male speaker, we can see, so these ellipses represent 95% distribution of everything that I tagged as an according to the vowel, and we can see they kind of do nicely distribute where we expect, and we do see quite a large circle here for that central vowel. Unfortunately, I believe this is due to just having less tokens. However, hopefully with more data, it will kind of shrink and get back a little bit more centrally. Now, with the nasal vowels, there's no kind of nice minimal sets after a single consonant that I can give you. Instead, I can give you minimal or near minimal pairs with other words. So in the case, though, of boiling and wrap, that is a minimal pair. And there's no oral/nasal vowel contrast after nasal consonants, so all vowels are nasalized in this context. So I'll show you another vowel plot now. And this is with all phonetically nasal vowels, so phonemically nasal plus vowels after nasal consonants, and we can see there's kind of a similar distribution there. The nice 5 vowels there, and there's kind of no ellipsis taking up the space here, suggesting that there really isn't a central nasal vowel. And if we put the two plots together, we can see that they kind of roughly match between the nasal and oral vowel counterparts as well. All right. Now, moving on to tone. At the moment, I'm positing there are 5 tonemes: a high level, a high falling, a mid-level, a mid-falling, and a low falling, which also coincides with breathy phonation. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice minimal set across all 5 tones. Unsurprisingly, this is pretty rare. Also, because of the way that I collected my data, kind of looking for maximal segmental contrasts, I don't have a lot of kind of 3-way, 4-way contrasts in the system. This kind of first set here on the left is probably the largest set that I'm certain is a kind of a tone minimal set. The rest is a little bit more near minimal and a little bit more hand wavy segmentally. So I'll play this first set for you in just a second. Just to keep in mind, the tokens that you're about to hear are in the isolation context. So you'll hear a little bit of list intonation at the end. However, the kind of tone does come out in the first half of the syllable. So I'll play that now, and hopefully you can hear the contrasts.
Na, 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 na.
And I'll play it one more time.
Na, 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 na.
All right. So I've actually been doing further work with Constantin Caland of the University of Cologne to see whether this hypothesis can be seen from a computational perspective. So he's been working on a cluster analysis program to effectively group F0 contours together, whether this be tone or intonation. In the case of the work that we've been doing together, it's been tone. And if we posit 5 clusters, they do seem initially to kind of correspond to the 5 that I believe that I find in the data. So group 1 there corresponds to the high level, 2 to the high fall, 3 to the mid fall, 4 to the mid level, and 5 to the low fall. As you can see, the contours and where they start do seem to kind of differ across things, but we can see there's like a fall here, a more distinct fall, and then a low fall, low level. It might be just a case more there of terminology. And when we compare the results of the cluster analysis to, I guess, more and more manual qualitative analysis, there is a little bit of clash in the 2 analyses. So here, the tokens I've marked in red were different in the cluster analysis opposed to my one, but the differences were actually not that big. Is that, for example, here cooked, which I think is a high fall, came out as a medium fall in the cluster analysis. The mid-level I also believe came out as a mid-fall. High fall came out, I think, as a mid-level, and here the low fall came out, for cut hair came out as a mid-fall. So it's not that the cluster analysis is getting wildly different results. It just might be a question of calibration or of figuring out if there's kind of annotation problems or things like this. But it's turning out to be kind of a promising way of examining the data from another perspective. All right. Now, going on to phonotactics, there are 2 basic syllable shapes that you find in Kera'a. The minimal syllable shape is a consonant, a vowel, and with tone. Then you can get a glide as a C2, an optional C coda, or you also just find a nasalized vowel in lieu of that coda. In terms of this glide, you only really see 4 of them that are W sorry, r, w, y, and l. But these do have a limited distribution. So if we look at this table here, we can see that while l kind of goes nice across anything, everything where you can have a C2, the w is really restricted to following bilabials, and then you do find it following the glottal stop. The y seems to only really come out after the th, and the glottal stop, and the l only occurs after the glottal stop. So glottal stop clusters are a little bit difficult. So the first thing is that they're not really differentiated in the everyday orthography by speakers. So this kind of raises the question if speakers do really perceive these. But the l only does occur as a C2 in this cluster. It doesn't occur as a C1 elsewhere in Mindri. One reason why it might be harder to perceive is because realization can be quite varied. So the first thing that I think I perceived was this kind of idea of a tongue click. I'll show you an example in a second, and hopefully you'll also be able to hear that. It's also a question of things like the length of the glide. So a glide as a C1 versus a glide as a C2 does come out differently in terms of how long that glide is. And the other thing you can see if you look acoustically at the spectrogram, or for example in Pratt, you can see like a dip in amplitude and F0 contour, which I'll also show you in a second. And there's other good reasons to posit that these clusters are a thing, because they're also found in Kera'a. Now, here we have a waveform spectrogram of the sentence I said throw, produced by my male speaker. And we can see here in this first one, there's a bit of a like wavy F0, but there's also 2 bars of striation there. And we see in the second one, there's a bar of striation and a little dip here. And this is the kind of the signs we can see in the spectrogram suggesting there's a glottal stop. I'm about to play it for you. I can hear tongue clicks. Hopefully you can also hear these. So I'll just play it now. And one more time.
3 minutes.
So, thank you. So it's incredibly hard to perceive, and I still get very confused about whether I have a glottal stop y, for example, as opposed to just a normal y. That's just something I've got to train. With codas, most native monosyllabic roots don't seem to have codas, but I believe there are good reasons to pose a coda position in phonotactically. The first is that there appear to be some sort of gemination process, which results in a geminated consonant occurring in a coda position if the phonological context is right. At the moment, the kind of broadest characterization I can give is the 2 elements are adjacent within the same intonation unit. It might be a little bit more, it's more exact of a rule than that, I'm sure. There's also kind of some evidence from word internal vowel loss processes where an onset is reanalyzed as a coda, particularly put in Mindri. So we see words like a troponta, meaning firewood pieces in other dialects, correspond to a trukta in Mindri. And borrowings do also retain their codas. So now kind of zooming out a little bit more to finish up the presentation. First, I'll just compare how Mindri fits in with the other dialects. So the segmental inventories are largely identical. It's just more about the distribution. So l is found as a simplex onset, so as a C1 in the other dialects. The cognate forms of these words do kind of show a more lenited consonant. And the complex cluster seems to additionally correspond to, for example, a palatal approximant in Mitu. Tone, impressionistically, does differ from dialect to dialect. So my analysis of tone in Mindri does match here with the Chinese description of Idu, but it does seem more complex than Midu in the lower belt, and Mitu as well, although I'm not entirely sure how that kind of matches up. Now, there seems to be some kind of ongoing processes of change across all dialects. So consonant clusters are becoming simplified. Perhaps that's one reason why we don't see an even distribution across all of the C2. And you also see some simplex onsets being lost in more innovative varieties, of which Mindri is one. The central vowel seems to be being reanalyzed. Maybe that's why I haven't gotten so many tokens. It's not clear if this is dependent on environment. There also might be a seventh vowel, which seems to be present in idiolects of older speakers, but this seems to be completely absent in the idiolects of younger speakers as well. So on that note, I will finish up. So Prabha, thank you very much. Feel free to ask me questions or email me later.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for that presentation. And I would love to take have you take some questions now.
Whoa.
I have a question.
Oh, yeah,
Go
ahead.
My question is, one of your sources you said was in Chinese. I'm curious, do you know Chinese? Or did you just find a translation, or how were you able to access that source?
Right. So I don't know Chinese myself. I have learnt Japanese previously, so obviously characters give me a little bit of an in, and I definitely sat down with a kind of an app where I could draw the characters and kind of figure out the meaning. But in terms of the description of the tone, there was a nice little section where it kind of just put out the tone numbers and had kind of statistics next to it. So that in itself was easy enough to interpret. The rest takes a little bit more effort.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
I've got a question about the mid-falling tone.
Yes.
Seems to me the final glottal stop there in your citation token. So you might want to look at that. And also duration might be an interesting difference to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, I've only really been investigating kind of in more depth the ones in context, because then obviously you don't have the list intonation effects. So I haven't really looked into length yet, but thank you for that. I will definitely check into it.
Hi, Naomi. I have a question as well.
Yeah.
Regarding the prenasalized consonants.
Yep.
So you assume them to be underlyingly just voiced,
Yes.
with the prenasalization being secondary.
Yep.
Have you looked at Etima, where I think David Bradley says there are some that are Proto-Tibeto-Burman, like drink, where, you know, it might actually be a historical remnant?
So I haven't compared them historically yet. I can say, at least for drink, it's a voiceless stop. So that one might not help. But yeah, it's unfortunately going to be a hard slog going through that kind of stuff, especially because we don't know quite where Kera'a fits in yet. But yes, thank you for that one as well.
Yeah, just to follow up, and have you maybe found that sonority of voicing is lesser on the stop itself when you get the prenasalization than when you don't?
What exactly do you mean by that?
Because my field language has prenasalized voiceless, which is a little
Right.
rare typologically.
Yeah.
And sometimes the voice in spread, and you lose the prenasalization that comes onto the,
right.
But it's just a different kind of thing. But I was just wondering whether you get an interplay, because you have prenasalization in some contexts initially, right? Utterance initially, and no prenasalization elsewhere, whether you might find a voice indifferent in realization, a voice indifference, sorry.
Yeah. So the first thing to say would be that I haven't looked into it in detail. So whatever I'm just saying now is more conjecture. I haven't noticed any sonority differences. When it is kind of, let's say, word medial, is quite voiced, quite happy to be voiced. But yeah, there doesn't seem to be any sort of contrast between a prenasalized voice and prenasalized voice. Sorry, a prenasalized plus a voice consonant and prenasalized plus a voiceless consonant. So it might just be an allophonic process if it's there.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Hi. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really interesting. I was
Thank
just
you.
wondering if you could tell us a little more about that high central vowel.
Yeah.
I don't remember if you played us a sample, but yeah.
No,
can you
I didn't.
Tell us a little more about that.
Right. So it's, as I mentioned towards the end, it's currently I believe it's currently on its way out of the language. So it seems to correspond sometimes to an e or an u, or sorry, a we or an u, but it seems to be stable for most speakers in just a glottal stop vowel context. That's or a rhotic vowel context, and normally it will kind of always come out as a central one.
And there's no sort of like labial frication or anything like that with it?
Not that I'm aware of. Again, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Yeah, it's like it does seem to be kind of, I mean, given that one of the possible cognate forms in speakers that don't really have it is a we, maybe there is some sort of kind of label frication going on. There is something happening.
I was just curious. We have this vowel in Lutuv, which we're working with here in Indiana, and they also have bar I and bar U, so they have very dense high vowel space. But what we find is a similar, like, huge territory for the vowel that you're remarking on, and it's, in theory the unrounded counterpart of oo, but there's some rounding, but not labial frication, and for the barred U there is. So certainly get more data, but your space may not shrink too much. It seems quite, at least in Lutuv, it's also highly variable.
Okay,
so
thank
there's
you.
That.
Yeah, interesting.
Thank you.
You also need to look at the lip maneuver. That is, if you have video, you can look at whether there's lip compression or lip rounding. This is compression rounding in your high back vowel. And that might also show you whether there's a difference for the lip U or the U vowel.
Yeah, I think I've got video data, especially of older speakers, so who are more likely to have that vowel. So hopefully that can give me some clues.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have to stop here now and move on to the next presentation, but definitely email Naomi with any more questions that you have.
Thank you, Naomi. That was very nice.
Very nice.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Naomi.